There had always been noise within the immaterial sea. Not sound as mortals understood it, but a ceaseless turbulence of sensation, rage without direction, desire without end, grief without rest. The warp churned with the echoes of uncountable souls, each thought given shape, each fear made real, each hunger sharpened into something that could endure beyond flesh. It was not merely a realm, it was a storm that had never known stillness. Yet now, in places too distant to name and too deep to chart, something faltered. At first it was not noticed. A single eddy ceased its rotation. A current of anguish unraveled and did not reform. The lesser entities, those drifting fragments of sentience that clung to the edges of greater horrors, found themselves adrift in an unfamiliar absence. They did not understand it. They could not, for they had never known what it was to exist without the pressure of endless becoming. The silence was not empty. It was imposed. Across the void between stars, astropaths faltered mid-transmission. Choirs trained to endure the shrieking tides of the warp found, for a fleeting moment, that there was nothing to resist. No claws of madness reached for them. No whispers coiled through their thoughts. Instead, there was a vast and suffocating stillness that pressed inward, not as an attack, but as a decree. Many broke under it, for the human mind, shaped to survive storms by bracing against it, found no defense against its absence. Where there had once been a storm to struggle against, there was now a depth too profound to measure a void not of emptiness, but of order so absolute it denied all motion. In the fortress monasteries of distant worlds, those attuned to the immaterial felt it as a tightening, not a constriction of space, but of possibility itself. Paths that once branched infinitely through the warp now narrowed. Threads of fate that had once twisted freely now aligned, as though drawn toward a singular, unseen gravity. Something was gathering. It did not roar its arrival. It did not announce itself in fire or revelation. It simply began to be. Deep within the warp, beyond the territories claimed by entities that called themselves gods, there existed regions even they did not name. These were not realms of dominion, but of neglect, vast stretches where the tides of emotion had grown thin, where the echoes of mortal thought had faded into near nothingness. Here, even demons rarely tread, for there was little to sustain them. It was here that the first true silence took hold. A daemon, ancient by the measure of its kind, drifted through that desolation. It was a thing of shifting form, sustained by fragments of long-forgotten wars and dying civilization. It sought new currents, new minds to infest, new agonies to feed upon. Yet as it moved, it felt something it could not name. Resistance, not from another will, nor from a rival force, but from the space itself. The warp did not yield. For the briefest instant an impossibility within that realm, the creature hesitated, its form uncertain. The currents it relied upon to shape its existence no longer responded as they should. They did not twist or surge. They did not carry it forward. They held. Then came the chain. It did not manifest as metal, nor as any substance known to reality. It was an inevitability given form, a line drawn through the essence of the creature, binding it not by force, but by conclusion. There was no struggle, for struggle required the possibility of escape, and that possibility had been
dominion
removed.
over both
The
warp
daemon
and
did
death.
not scream.
Let this
It could
throne
not.
of bones
Its
rise
nature,
as a
once fluid and
testament to my
unbound,
eternal
was suddenly
rule.
defined. Its existence, once sustained by endless change, was reduced to a single, unalterable state. It was taken, not consumed, not destroyed, but claimed. Across the warp, similar moments began to unfold, isolated at first, unnoticed by the great powers whose attention was fixed upon their eternal rivalries. But the pattern grew. Where there had been turbulence, there was now stillness. Where there had been chaos, there was now direction. And always, beneath it all, there was the sense of something vast and unmoving. Something that did not emerge from the warp, but beneath it. In the material realm, the consequences began as whispers. Ships translating through the immaterial reported anomalies. Journeys that should have taken weeks stretched into months, not through delay but through deviation. Navigators, their minds attuned to the currents of the warp, found those currents altered. Not chaotic, as was their nature, but guided as though following unseen pathways that led elsewhere. Some spoke of glimpsing a horizon where none should exist. worlds where the veil between realities was thin, where the warp bled freely into the material, phenomena long considered immutable began to fail. Manifestations faltered. Possessions ended abruptly, not in exorcism, but in absence. The entities that had once infested mortal forms were simply gone. Not banished, not slain. Removed. Scholars and seers sought explanations, but their frameworks faltered. The warp was, by its nature, unknowable in its totality. It could not be governed, could not be contained. It was the reflection of all minds, and thus as fractured and infinite as thought itself. Yet now there were signs of structure, not imposed from above, as tyrants might impose order upon a world, but rising from below, as foundations might emerge to support what had never before known stability. And at the center of it, though no being, the silence did not remain contained. What had begun as a distant stillness within the depths of the immaterial now pressed outward, threading itself through the countless fractures where reality and unreality touched. It did not surge like a storm, nor spread like a contagion. It advanced with a deliberate inevitability, as though each moment of its existence had already been accounted for long before it arrived. On a world long forgotten by any central authority, orbiting a dim and aging star, the first undeniable sign manifested. The planet had no name that endured. Its surface was a scarred expanse of broken cities and ash-choked plains, where the remnants of humanity clung to survival not through unity, but through isolation. Generations had passed without guidance, and in that absence, belief had fractured into countless local rites and desperate superstitions. Among them all, one constant remained: the fear of death did not end with death. For on that world, the veil was thin. Those who died did not pass cleanly. Their echoes lingered, sometimes as faint impressions, sometimes as violent apparitions that clawed their way back into the realm of flesh. The people had learned to burn their dead, to scatter their remains, to deny them anchors. It was never enough. The warp bled through, and the dead found ways to return, until the night it stopped. It began with a single death, unremarkable in its cause. A man, aged beyond his strength, succumbed to the slow erosion of time. His kin performed the rites they had always known: fire, ash, dispersal. They waited, as they always did, for the signs that would follow, the cold wind that carried whispers, the flicker of movement where none should be, the subtle distortion of thought that marked the presence of something that had refused to depart. Nothing came. At first, this absence was taken as a blessing, a rare moment of peace in a world that had forgotten such things. Yet as the hours stretched into days, unease took root. For the patterns they had relied upon, the grim certainties that had shaped their understanding of existence, had been broken. Elsewhere across the planet, similar deaths occurred, and none returned. The priests of the fractured faiths gathered, drawn together not by unity, but by shared confusion. They spoke of wards failing to activate, of rituals that found no purchase, of the immaterial currents that had once surged beneath their incantations now lying still and unresponsive. Some claimed that the warp itself had withdrawn, retreating from the world as though repelled. Others feared a more terrible truth, that something had taken its place. The answer came not through revelation, but through witness. A child, wandering beyond the boundaries of a settlement, stood at the edge of a barren valley where the ground had long since been stripped of life. There, beneath a sky dimmed by perpetual haze, she saw a figure. It was not a ghost, nor was it flesh. It stood with a solidity that defied both, a presence that did not flicker or waver as the entities of the warp so often did. Its form was cloaked in shadow, not as concealment, but as essence. Where its face should have been, there was only depth, an absence that drew the eye not through horror, but through inevitability. The child did not flee, for there was no malice in it, only purpose. Behind the figure, the air itself seemed to fold, not torn, not ruptured, but parted, as though reality acknowledged a passage that had always existed, but had never before been seen. From that passage came other shapes less defined, yet bound by the same stillness. They moved without haste, without deviation, forming a procession that neither began nor ended. And among them, something was carried. The child could not name it, but she felt its nature with a clarity that transcended understanding. It was a soul not as the warp had always held them, fragmented and writhing but whole, bound not by agony or desire, but by a single, unalterable state. A chain extended from it, not forged, not imposed, but inherent. It did not bind the soul through force, but through truth. It declared, without question or opposition, that this being had reached its conclusion. The figure at the forefront raised a hand. The gesture was simple. The effect was absolute. Across the valley, where once the echoes of the dead had lingered, there was nothing, no residue of presence, no distortion of thought, no lingering trace of what had been. It was not that the dead had been denied return. It was that return was no longer a possibility. The child watched as the procession moved forward, passing not through the world, but beneath it. The ground did not part, yet they descended. The air did not shift, yet they vanished. And in their wake, there remained only silence. She would speak of it, in time. Others would listen. And slowly, the truth would spread. This was not an isolated event. Across the planet, and beyond it, similar moments unfolded. Souls that had once been claimed by the endless tides of the warp were no longer dissolving into its madness. They were being taken elsewhere, drawn along paths that had not existed before, guided by entities that did not resemble the horrors mortals had come to expect. The warp did not rage against this. It did not resist. For resistance required opposition, and what had emerged did not oppose. It concluded. Deep within the immaterial, the chains multiplied. Each one cast not outward, but downward into a depth that had no measure. They did not entangle or ensnare in the manner of the warp's own bindings. They defined. They separated. They determined what was and what would no longer be. And as the first of them extended into infinity, the nature of death itself began to change. Not as a concept, but as a certainty that could no longer be denied, altered, or undone. The chains did not cease once they had been cast. They continued, descending through the immeasurable depth beneath the immaterial, threading through that which had never before been structured. Each soul drawn along their length did not resist, for resistance had no meaning where conclusion had already been declared, and as their number grew, so too did the shape of the place to which they were drawn. It was not a realm born of thought, nor was it a reflection of mortal emotion. It did not churn or reshape itself in response to belief, nor did it fracture beneath contradiction. Where the warp was an ocean of becoming, this was something else entirely, a foundation that did not yield, a domain that did not change because change had no authority within it. At its center, the throne endured. It had no beginning that could be traced. It did not rise from the surrounding expanse, nor did it appear to have been constructed. It simply was, as though it had always existed in a state of waiting, unoccupied until the moment that required its presence. Its form was carved not from matter, but from the principle of finality itself, edges defined not by shape, but by certainty. Upon it sat the one who had claimed it. He did not arrive in conquest. There had been no war, no struggle, no overthrow of prior dominion. The warp had not been challenged in the manner it understood, for challenge implied conflict, and conflict implied opposition. What had taken form here did not oppose. It existed beyond the need to contend. Hades, the Lord of Endings, regarded the immaterial with an expression that did not shift. His presence did not ripple outward in waves of influence as the powers of the warp did. There was no emanation of desire, no hunger seeking sustenance, no fury demanding release. Where the great entities of chaos fed upon the endless tide of mortal thought, he required nothing. He did not hunger. And in that absence, he could not be fed, could not be tempted, could not be altered. Around the throne, the first of the claimed gathered. They did not drift as souls once had within the warp. They did not scream, did not fracture, did not dissolve into lesser fragments of themselves. Each remained whole, defined not by the chaos that had once threatened to consume them, but by the singular truth that had been imposed upon their existence. They had ended, and in that ending they had been preserved. The space they occupied did not stretch infinitely, nor did it compress beneath the weight of their number. It expanded only as required, forming structure where structure was necessary, shaping itself not through will, but through function. There were boundaries, though none could see them. There were divisions, though none were drawn. All things were where they were meant to be. The silence that permeated this realm was not absence, it was order unbroken. From the throne, Hades observed the currents above. The warp, in its endless motion, had begun to change. Not wholly, not yet, but in fragments that could no longer be dismissed as anomalies. The regions where chains had been cast were no longer as they had been. The turbulence had lessened. The forms that had once dominated those spaces had diminished, their presence either removed or reduced to something that could no longer assert itself as before. The great powers had taken notice. They did not perceive Hades as mortals might perceive a rival. To them he was not a being to be understood through identity, but a phenomenon and intrusion upon the natural state of their existence. They reached toward it, probing the edges of this new stillness, seeking to define it within the terms they understood. They found nothing they could grasp, for there was no emotion to seize, no thought to corrupt, no desire to manipulate. The essence of Hades did not resonate within the frequencies that sustained them. It did not echo their nature, nor did it oppose it in a way that could be engaged. It simply denied them, not through force, but through irrelevance. Where his influence spread, their presence faltered. Not destroyed, not eradicated, but rendered without purpose. The energies they drew upon did not vanish, but they ceased to respond. The tides they once commanded no longer obeyed the impulses that had shaped them since the dawn of their existence. This was not war, it was displacement, and in that distinction lay a truth the warp had never encountered. For war could be fought, it could be resisted, adapted to, turned in unexpected directions, but displacement offered no such recourse. It did not engage, it did not struggle. It simply replaced what had been with what must be. Within his domain, Hades rose. The motion was neither hurried nor slow. It occurred because it was required, and thus it was done. The souls nearest the throne did not react, for reaction implied uncertainty, and uncertainty had no place here. He stepped forward, descending from the seat that defined his authority, and as he did, the realm adjusted. Paths formed where none had been. Not roads or bridges, but lines of inevitability that extended outward, connecting the throne to the farthest reaches of the growing dominion. Along these paths, the wardens moved those shadowed figures that had first been witnessed upon the forgotten world. They did not speak. They did not question. They carried out the function for which they existed, guiding the chains, ensuring that each soul reached its designated place without deviation. Hades moved among them, not as a ruler surveying his subjects, but as a constant within the system he embodied. His gaze passed over each soul, not in judgment, for judgment had already been rendered, but in acknowledgement of the state they now occupied. None were beyond his notice. None were beneath it. Above, the warp trembled. Not in fury, but in something approaching uncertainty. The patterns that had governed it since its inception were no longer absolute. There were regions now where chaos did not reign, where the endless cycle of creation and destruction had been interrupted by something that did not participate in the cycle at all, something that ended it. And as the first true boundaries of this new dominion solidified, as the throne beneath reality anchored itself with unyielding certainty, a truth began to take shape, one that even the greatest entities of the warp could not ignore. There was now a lord within the immaterial who did not seek to rule through power, who did not sustain himself through worship, who did not define his existence through conflict. He ruled because all things, in time, would belong to him, not by conquest, but by the simple, unalterable fact that all things must end. The realization did not spread through the warp as knowledge spreads among mortals. There were no words exchanged, no declarations carried across its shifting tides. Yet the great entities that dwelled within its depths began to perceive a change that could not be ignored, for it did not conform to the nature of their existence. Something was being removed from them, not taken in violence, not stripped through force, but diminished through absence. The energies that had once surged endlessly, rage, despair, excess, decay, still existed in abundance across the material galaxy. Mortals continued to suffer, to desire, to destroy. The source of power remained untouched. Yet the reflection of that power within the warp was no longer constant. Where once emotion had translated instantly into form, birthing entities and feeding those already present, there were now delays, interruptions, and, in some places, complete severance. The link between cause and manifestation faltered, as though something intervened between the moment of feeling and the moment of creation. In those spaces, madness did not take shape. It ended before it could begin. At first, the lesser entities suffered the consequence. Demons born of fleeting impulses, brief flashes of terror, transient moments of hatred failed to fully coalesce. They flickered into partial existence, unstable and incomplete, before collapsing into nothingness without ever achieving form. This had never occurred before. Even the weakest of manifestations had always found some foothold within the warp, sustained by the infinite well of mortal experience. Now, that certainty was gone. More troubling still, those that had long endured began to falter. Ancient beings, shaped by epochs of conflict and sustained by the continuous flow of suffering, found themselves diminished not by opposition, but by a quiet erosion. Their forms, once vast and ever-changing, became defined in ways they did not comprehend. The fluidity that had allowed them to adapt, to grow, to regenerate from any setback was constrained. They were no longer endless. They could perceive boundaries. And where there are boundaries, there is the possibility of conclusion. The first to truly recognize the threat were not the greatest among them, but those who existed on the threshold between persistence and dissolution. Entities that had endured only through careful navigation of the warp's shifting currents, neither powerful enough to dominate, nor weak enough to be consumed. These beings began to vanish. Not in battle, not through consumption by greater predators, but through a process that defied the logic of their existence. They were drawn inward, their essence pulled along lines that could not be seen but could be felt, a tightening, a narrowing of possibility until there was only one path remaining. And then, they were gone. The regions they had occupied did not erupt in chaos, as might have been expected. There was no violent displacement, no surge of competing forces rushing to fill the void. Instead, there was stillness, a stillness that persisted. This was the true anomaly, for the warp abhorred emptiness. It reshaped itself constantly to ensure that no absence remained unfilled. Yet now, there were expanses where nothing replaced what had been lost. No new entities formed. No residual energy lingered. It was as though those regions had been defined not by what they contained, but by what they would no longer allow. The great powers turned their attention more fully to these anomalies. They extended their awareness, probing the edges of these silent zones, seeking to impose their will upon them. In other circumstances, such an intrusion would have reshaped the space instantly, bending it to their nature, flooding it with the essence that defined their existence. But here, their influence did not take hold. It did not resist them. It simply did not respond. This absence of reaction was more profound than any opposition. It denied them the very framework through which they exerted control. Without a medium that could be shaped, without a current that could be directed, their presence had no effect. They could not enter, not because they were barred, but because there was nothing within those regions that could become them. The silence deepened. Within it, the chains continued their work. Each one extended with precision, threading through the warp not as foreign intrusions, but as corrections, realignments of a reality that had long existed without constraint. Where they passed, the chaotic interplay of emotion and manifestation was severed, replaced by a directness that allowed no deviation. A soul that would have once dissolved into the tides of madness was now intercepted. A daemon that would have fed upon it found nothing to grasp. The process did not require conflict. It did not require victory. It required only that the chain reach its conclusion. And so the nature of the warp began to alter. Not wholly, not uniformly, but in fragments that grew with each passing moment. The endless cycle of creation and destruction, of birth and consumption, began to lose its cohesion. Events that should have cascaded into greater turmoil simply stopped. Storms unraveled. Currents dissipated. Entire regions, once defined by perpetual violence, fell into a quiet that could not be broken. This was not the death of the warp. It was the death of its madness. And as that madness receded, something else became visible, not a presence, but a structure that had always been hidden beneath the chaos, a depth that had no place in the fluid, ever-changing nature of the immaterial. It was from this depth that the chains originated, and it was toward this depth that all things touched by them were drawn. The realization, when it came, was not understood as mortals understand revelation. It was felt as a shift in the fundamental nature of existence, a recognition that the rules by which the warp had always operated were no longer absolute. There was now an end, not a distant possibility, not an abstract concept, but an active force that moved through the immaterial with certainty and purpose. The great powers did not yet act in unison. Their nature did not allow for such cohesion. Each perceived the change through the lens of its own existence, interpreting it as a distortion, a threat, or an anomaly to be studied and, eventually, overcome. But none could deny what was occurring. Madness, which had once been infinite, was now finite, and in that finitude lay the first true limitation the warp had ever known. The silence did not announce its victory. It did not need to. For with each region that fell still, with each entity that vanished without struggle, the truth became more defined. Chaos was not being defeated. It was being concluded. The conclusion of madness did not pass unanswered, yet the answer that formed was unlike any conflict the warp had ever known. For the entities that had long defined its nature could not respond as they were accustomed, and what rose against them did not behave as an enemy. There was no declaration, no surge of gathered will, no convergence of power to meet a rising threat. The great dominions of the immaterial, vast and ever-shifting, did not align in purpose, for they had never required unity. Each existed as an absolute within its own nature, sustained by the endless influx of mortal experience. To unite would have required compromise, and compromise was a concept alien to their being. Yet each became aware of loss. Not sudden, not catastrophic, but undeniable. Territories that had once been extensions of their essence, regions where their influence had been absolute, began to recede. The tides that defined them withdrew, not as a retreat, but as an erasure of presence. Where they had once been, there was now only the same silent structure that had spread from the unseen depths. It did not claim those regions through conquest. It replaced them. The first attempts at response were instinctive. Extensions of will reached outward, probing the altered spaces, seeking to reassert dominance. Where once such efforts would have reshaped entire expanses in moments, now they found no purchase. The fabric of those regions did not yield, did not twist, did not reflect the force imposed upon it. It remained unchanged. This was not resistance. Resistance implied opposition, and opposition could be overcome. What the great powers encountered was absence not of existence, but of compatibility. Their nature could not take form within that which had been redefined. The realization did not come as a single moment, but as a gradual accumulation of failed assertions. Each attempt to reclaim what had been lost ended in the same result. Nothing. The silence did not react. It did not acknowledge the effort. It simply remained. And so, the first true divergence of intent emerged. Where the warp had once been a continuous expanse of interwoven influence, it now fractured along lines that could not be crossed. Domains of chaos persisted, vast and turbulent as they had always been, but between them spread growing regions where that turbulence ceased entirely. These were not borders drawn through agreement or conflict. They were boundaries defined by function areas where one nature could not extend into another. The immaterial had never known such division. Its essence had always been fluid, allowing for overlap, for intrusion, for the endless interplay of competing forces. Now, for the first time, there were places where that interplay ended. The great entities turned their attention not only outward, but inward. They examined their own dominions, tracing the edges where silence encroached. In doing so, they perceived the chains not as physical constructs, but as principles that threaded through existence. Each one marked a point of transition, where the endless variability of the warp gave way to something fixed. They sought to sever them. Power gathered, not in unity, but in parallel. Each entity, according to its nature, directed its essence toward these lines of inevitability, attempting to disrupt the process by which they extended. The results were consistent. The chains did not break. They did not bend. They did not even acknowledge the force applied to them. Where power met them, it dissipated, not absorbed, not repelled, but rendered irrelevant. The interaction simply ceased to produce effect, as though the very concept of interference had been excluded from their nature. This was not a war that could be fought. There were no victories to claim, no defeats to avenge. There was only a gradual, unyielding shift in the state of existence itself. Yet the nature of the warp demanded response. Unable to engage the source directly, the great powers turned to what remained within their reach, the currents of mortal emotion that still fed them. If the altered regions could not be reclaimed, then their own domains would be reinforced, intensified, expanded where possible. The flow of rage, of despair, of excess was drawn inward with greater urgency, shaping their territories into stronger reflections of their essence. For a time this appeared to stabilize their presence. The chaotic expanses surged with renewed intensity, storms of thought and feeling magnified beyond their previous scale. Daemons gathered in greater numbers, their forms strengthened by the concentrated influx of energy. The old patterns reasserted themselves, at least within the regions not yet touched by silence. But the chains continued. They did not accelerate in response to this surge, nor did they slow. They extended at a constant, measured pace, unaffected by the fluctuations around them. Where they reached, the intensified chaos found no entry. The boundaries held, and beyond them, the strengthened storms simply ceased to exist. It became clear that amplification was not a solution. The more the great powers drew upon the mortal realm, the more defined their own domains became, and the more sharply they were contrasted against the regions they could not enter. Their existence, once infinite in its expression, was now confined by something that did not seek to contain, but simply existed beyond their influence. This was the war that had begun, a war without fury. There were no clashes of opposing forces, no great confrontations that could be witnessed or recorded. There was only a steady progression, a quiet displacement that redefined the nature of the immaterial without ever engaging in the struggle that defined it. The warp had always been a place where conflict was constant and absolute. Now, it faced something that did not participate in conflict at all, and in that absence it found itself unable to prevail. Within the growing silence, the understructure continued to take form. Paths extended, not through effort, but through necessity. The souls drawn along them increased in number, each one reinforcing the presence of the realm below. The throne remained unmoved, its authority not asserted, but inherent. And Hades, who did not hunger, did not act to hasten the process. He did not need to, for the nature of what had begun ensured that it would continue. Above, the warp shifted, its endless madness now punctuated by regions of finality that could not be undone. The great powers, for all their vastness, could do nothing to halt their expansion. They could only watch as their dominion was not destroyed, but rendered incomplete. And in that incompleteness, a truth emerged that none of them could ignore. There existed now within the immaterial a force that could not be opposed because it did not engage in opposition. A force that could not be consumed because it did not exist within the cycle of consumption. A force that did not seek victory and thus could not be denied it. The war continued, and it could not be won, yet perceived fully there was a throne, not wrought of gold or adorned with symbols of dominion, but carved from something deeper than matter. It was a seat not of power seized, but of authority inherent. It did not command the warp to change. It defined the terms by which change could occur. Upon it sat a presence that did not hunger, did not rage. I did not desire it. It simply was. And in its being, the endless storm of the warp found itself confronted not by opposition, but by inevitability. The silence spread, not swiftly, not violently, but with the quiet certainty of something that could not be resisted because it did not seek to overcome. It sought only to conclude. And for the first time since the dawn of the immaterial, the warp began to understand the concept of an ending. The silence that had spread through the immaterial was no longer confined to isolated regions. It had begun to connect itself, forming continuity where once there had been only fractured stillness. The boundaries between silent domains did not dissolve, but they aligned, creating passages that had not existed before, routes defined, not by motion, but by certainty. Along these routes, the chains extended further than ever. They no longer descended solely into the depth beneath the warp. They now traced paths across it, linking points of cessation into a vast and growing network. Each soul that had been claimed became part of this structure, not as a fragment of chaos, but as a fixed point within a system that did not deviate. And through this system, movement began to occur in a form that defied the nature of the immaterial. It was not travel as understood by those who once navigated the warp. There was no passage through storm or tide, no struggle against currents of thought and emotion. Instead, there was transition and immediate alignment from one state of existence to another. Souls did not drift, they were relocated. Not by force, but by placement. At the edges of these pathways, figures appeared. They were not born of the warp's chaos, nor were they reflections of mortal belief. They carried no distortion of identity, no fragmentation of form. Each stood complete, defined in a way that resisted the instability that characterized all things within the immaterial. They did not announce themselves. They did not emerge through rupture or manifestation. They simply were present where they were required. Among them, one presence moved with greater consistency than the others. It did not lead in the manner of command, nor did it guide through persuasion. Its role was not imposed, but inherent. Where it passed, the chains aligned more precisely, as though acknowledging its function within the structure. This presence did not speak. It did not need to. The souls that encountered it did not react with fear or reverence, for such responses required comparison to known forces. Here, there was no basis for comparison. Instead, there was recognition not of identity, but of inevitability. This was the ferryman. The name did not exist as a title spoken or remembered. It formed within understanding itself, as though the concept had always been present and merely required definition. The ferryman did not carry souls in the manner of transport. He guided transition from one state of existence to another, ensuring that what had been concluded reached its designated outcome without deviation. The pathways he moved along were not physical. They were not metaphysical either, in the sense the warp had long understood. They were structures of conclusion, lines along which existence itself had been resolved into direction. Where these paths intersected the remnants of the warp, something unprecedented occurred. The chaotic entities that once dominated those regions did not engage. They did not attack or retreat. Instead, they found themselves unable to perceive the paths as valid points of interaction. Their awareness slid past them, unable to anchor upon what did not exist within their framework of understanding. Even those of immense power, who had once shaped entire domains through will alone, found themselves excluded from recognition. The ferryman's path did not resist them. It did not repel them. It simply did not acknowledge their presence as relevant to its function. And so, they passed by, unchallenged, but also unpermitted to interfere. Across the material galaxy, the effects began to manifest in ways that mortals could not fully comprehend. Death, once a transition into the warp, no longer followed its former trajectory. Souls that should have dissolved into chaos instead encountered stillness, a moment of suspension in which their essence was neither consumed nor scattered. Then came the alignment. They were drawn along the chains, through the ferryman's path, into the expanding structure beneath reality. To those left behind, the absence was immediate. The echoes that once lingered in places of death no longer formed. The sensation of lingering presence, so long a constant across countless worlds, was fading. Even the most attuned psychers began to notice the change. Where once they had felt the pressure of countless souls pressing against the veil, they now perceived something else, a directionality, as though the immaterial itself had begun to flow toward a singular, unseen destination. It was not chaotic, it was ordered. And order, in a place defined by disorder, was more terrifying than any storm. Within the warp, the great powers observed the development with growing disquiet. The ferryman did not appear as a rival force in the traditional sense. There was no expansion of influence in direct opposition to them, no claim of dominion over competing territories. Instead, there was a reclassification of function. What had once belonged to the endless cycle of chaos was now being redirected into a structure that did not participate in that cycle at all. Attempts to intercept the paths failed as before. Efforts to corrupt the process found no foothold. Even the act of observation became unreliable, as perception itself struggled to define what it was witnessing. For the ferryman did not move through the warp. He moved beneath it, and in doing so, he established a route that could not be followed by anything that remained bound to chaos. As the network expanded, its presence became more pronounced. The chains no longer extended randomly into infinity. They began to converge, forming junctions where multiple paths met. At these intersections, souls were not simply transferred, they were organized, not by judgment, not by emotion, but by finality. The structure beneath reality was no longer merely a destination. It was becoming a domain in its own right, defined not by what entered it, but by what could no longer leave. And at its center, unseen yet absolute, the authority that had set all of this into motion remained unchanged. Aides did not intervene. He did not guide the ferryman's path. He did not need to, for what had begun was not expansion through force, but the natural consequence of conclusion extended across infinity. And as the warp continued to fracture around these unyielding lines of passage, one truth began to emerge with increasing clarity. Nothing that had an end could escape what had been established beneath it. The ferryman's path did not remain hidden for long within the higher currents of the immaterial. Though it did not announce itself, its effects could no longer be mistaken for coincidence or anomaly. Entire sectors of the warp had begun to behave in ways that defied all precedent, and even those entities that had once dismissed change as an illusion were forced to acknowledge that something fundamental had shifted. The silence beneath reality had become structured enough to be observed, and observation, in the warp, was never without consequence. Deep within the material galaxy, upon the throne of impossible endurance, there existed a mind that had endured longer than empires, longer than faith, longer than the civilizations that now burned in ignorance of their own decay. It was a mind bound to a corpse of gold and broken circuitry, sustained not by life, but by necessity. The Emperor of mankind did not sleep. He did not dream in the manner of mortals, but he perceived. At first, it was subtle, a deviation in the expected resonance of the warp. The Astronomicon, that beacon of guided passage through immaterial chaos, did not falter, but it altered its rhythm. The currents it once illuminated no longer moved with their former unpredictability. There were gaps now, spaces where turbulence should have existed, yet did not. These absences were not random. They formed patterns. For the Emperor, who had once sought to master the immaterial through understanding rather than submission, patterns were never insignificant. Each deviation represented a shift in the underlying architecture of reality. And what he now observed was not merely change, but restructuring. He reached outward, not physically, nor through psychic projection as others understood it, but through a will that had been refined across millennia of suffering and vigilance. His awareness extended into the warp, not as intrusion, but as inquiry. He did not impose himself upon it. He listened. What he found was absence where there should have been noise, and direction where there should have been chaos. The Emperor had long understood the nature of the warp as humanity knew it, a realm shaped by emotion, belief, and the endless echo of sentient existence. It was not stable, nor was it meant to be. Its instability was its defining characteristic. Any attempt to impose order upon it had always resulted in resistance, backlash, corruption, or collapse. Yet what he now perceived did not behave according to any of those outcomes. There was order, but it was not imposed. It was inherent. Across the regions he reached into, the Emperor encountered the chains. They were not visible in the conventional sense. They were not structures of matter or energy. They were constraints upon possibility itself, lines along which existence had been reduced to singular outcomes. Where they passed, the warp did not resist his awareness. It did not conceal itself. It simply ceased to respond to his presence as it once had. This, more than anything, concerned him, for even the chaos gods had always reacted to his will, with hatred, with manipulation, with defiance, but always with reaction. They were defined by opposition as much as by their own nature. Yet here, there was no opposition to engage, only silence. And beneath that silence, something moving with purpose that did not align with any known force. He turned his attention further. Beyond the reach of conventional perception, beyond even the boundaries of the Astronomican's influence, the Emperor perceived the expansion of the ferryman's path. It was not a structure that could be mapped in any traditional sense. It existed as a redefinition of transition itself, a system through which the dead no longer returned to the warp as they once had. Instead, they were redirected, not into oblivion, not into torment, but into containment. The implications were immediate and profound. For the Imperium of Man, and for all sentient civilizations that had come to depend upon the predictable horrors of the warp, death had always been uncertain but consistent in its trajectory. Souls were lost, consumed, or transformed within the immaterial tides. This uncertainty had become a constant of existence. Now, that constant was breaking. The Emperor saw it clearly. If souls no longer returned to the warp in their former state, then the warp itself would begin to weaken in ways that defied traditional understanding. Its power was derived from the endless cycle of emotional and spiritual recycling. Interrupt that cycle, and the structure that depended upon it would begin to destabilize. Yet what troubled him more than the implication was the source. This was not the work of humanity. It was not the result of chaos. And it was not the design of any force he had previously encountered. He observed the absence of struggle within the system. The ferryman's path did not battle the warp. It did not corrupt it or reshape it through force. It simply functioned in a domain that the warp could not meaningfully interact with. This placed it beyond the dichotomy of order and chaos, beyond even the Emperor's own understanding of control. In the farthest reaches of his perception, he sensed the throne beneath reality. Not directly, not fully, but as a pressure against the foundations of existence itself. It did not call to him. It did not challenge him. It simply existed in parallel to all things, as though it had always been present but only now had become relevant to perception. And upon that throne, something remained unmoved. The Emperor did not mistake it for ally or enemy. It did not fit either classification. It was a principle made absolute. As he withdrew his awareness slightly, he considered what had been revealed. The warp was no longer solely the domain of chaos. It was becoming something segmented, structured, and partially inaccessible. Entire regions were being redefined by forces that did not participate in its traditional nature. This was not salvation, nor was it annihilation. It was transformation without consent. And such transformations, the Emperor knew, rarely remained contained. Far beyond the boundaries of his perception, the ferryman's path continued to expand, unchallenged by the forces that once defined the immaterial. Souls continued to be drawn into its structure. The silence beneath reality continued to deepen. And the Emperor of Mankind, for the first time in an age defined by unending vigilance, found himself confronted with a truth he could not yet direct. There were forces now shaping the fate of souls that did not recognize the authority of gods, demons, or emperors. And they were not slowing. The recognition that something beyond the established order was shaping the fate of souls did not remain confined to distant observation. It propagated through the immaterial currents, in a manner unlike any prior disturbance, not as rumor or signal, but as structural awareness. Even entities that did not share perception were forced into a shared understanding. The rules governing transition were no longer universal, and where rules fractured, response became inevitable. Within the depths of the warp, where the silence had expanded into stable regions of absence, the first coordinated reaction formed. It was not unity in the mortal sense, nor alliance in the traditional meaning of the word. It was convergence of necessity. Powers that had never aligned in purpose began to direct their attention toward a singular point of disruption, the expanding structure beneath reality where souls no longer dissolved into chaos, but were redirected beyond it. The absence of returned essence had become intolerable. For in the absence of consumption, their nature weakened. The judgment was not declared. It emerged as a consequence of instability. Where influence failed, where dominance ceased to propagate, correction was required by instinct rather than design. And so the unbound aspects of the warp, those entities least tethered to specific domains, least constrained by singular emotion or concept, were drawn into the effort. They did not march. They did not gather in procession. They simply converged, their awareness collapsing toward the regions where the ferryman's path intersected with the fading remnants of chaotic space. At these intersections, the first contact occurred. It was not a battle in the manner understood by mortal or demon. There were no opposing forms colliding in violent expression, no landscapes torn apart by competing forces. Instead, there was an attempt to assert definition upon what refused definition. The unbound entities extended themselves into the path. They attempted to infiltrate the structure, to reintroduce variability into what had become fixed. Their essence flowed outward in vast, shifting currents designed to overwhelm, to distort, to reclaim the lost territory through saturation of presence. And for the first time since the silence had begun, there was response. Not resistance, not retaliation. Judgment. The moment their essence crossed into the structured passage, it ceased to behave as chaos. The ferryman's path did not repel it, nor did it absorb it. It evaluated it. Not through perception or thought, but through an intrinsic mechanism of classification that existed independent of interpretation. The unbound were no longer unbound. Within the path, their existence was no longer defined by infinite possibility. It was reduced to singular state. Each fragment of their being was examined not for intent or power, but for conclusion. And in that examination, what could not sustain continuity was separated from what could. The result was immediate fragmentation. Not destruction in the conventional sense, for destruction implies force applied against resistance. Instead, there was disassembly of identity. Portions of the invading essence failed to align with the structure of the path and were removed from continuity entirely. They did not scatter back into the warp. They did not reform elsewhere. They ceased to qualify as existent within the system. The remaining portions recoiled instinctively, withdrawing from the boundary of the path. Yet even as they retreated, something had already changed. The attempt at intrusion had been recorded not as memory, but as adjustment. The structure beneath reality had accounted for the intrusion and incorporated the response into its continued function. The unbound entities found themselves altered. Their awareness, once fluid and infinite, now carried constraints they had not possessed before. The concept of limitation had been introduced into their existence, not as imposed restriction, but as consequence of interaction. This realization spread rapidly among them. For beings that had defined themselves through absence of constraint, the introduction of limitation was not merely discomforting, it was destabilizing. Their cohesion faltered as they attempted to reconcile their nature with the newly imposed condition of partial finitude. Within the broader warp, this failure manifested as instability. Regions connected to the unbound began to fluctuate unpredictably. The coherence of their domains weakened, not through external assault, but through internal contradiction. And still, the ferryman's path continued. Souls moved through it without deviation, unaffected by the attempted intrusion. Each transition reinforced the structure, each passage confirming the validity of the system that now governed death beyond the reach of chaos. It became increasingly evident that the path did not rely upon opposition to function. It did not require victory over those who resisted it. Its operation was independent of conflict. Whether observed, attacked, or ignored, it maintained its function without alteration. This was what made the judgment of the unbound irreversible. For once an entity had been processed through the structure, even partially, it could no longer return to its prior state of infinite variability. Something fundamental had been recorded within it, a definition that could not be fully erased. The great powers of the warp observed this with growing alarm. For the first time in their existence, they were confronted not by a rival force that sought to dominate them, but by a system that rendered parts of their essence inapplicable. Not destroyed, not opposed, but classified beyond their influence. Within the silence beneath reality, Hades remained unmoved. He did not expand the judgment. He did not accelerate it. He did not need to, for what had occurred was not an act of aggression, but a reflection of function. The ferryman's path did not judge in the manner of morality or intent, it judged through completion. And once completion had been defined, deviation no longer held meaning. Above, the warp trembled in a new way, not in fury, not in despair, but in recognition of something it had never been required to understand before, that parts of existence could be made final without conflict, and that what had been judged could no longer return unchanged. The consequences of the judgment of the unbound did not remain isolated within the regions where it had first occurred. Once limitation had been introduced into what was once infinite, the effect could not be contained. It propagated through the interconnected nature of the warp, altering not only those directly touched by the ferryman's path, but also the structures that depended upon their boundless continuity. War within the immaterial had always been defined by recurrence. Conflict did not end, it transformed. Every destruction was temporary, every defeat reversible. Entities shattered in battle reformed from residual essence. Domains consumed in one cycle of violence resurfaced in another, reshaped but never truly lost. This endless recursion was the foundation upon which the entire architecture of chaos depended. Now, that recursion was breaking. It began in regions where conflict had once been most intense. Battlefields of the warp, vast domains where rival entities clashed across shifting landscapes of thought and emotion suddenly failed to reconstitute their cycles. Where once destruction had immediately given rise to renewal, there was now delay, not absence, but interruption. At first, this was dismissed as fluctuation. The warp had always been unstable in surface behavior. Storms ebbed and surged, forms dissolved and reformed. But as the pattern persisted, a deeper truth became unavoidable. Entities destroyed within these conflicts were not returning in full. Fragments reformed, but incomplete. Essences once shattered into chaos did not fully reintegrate. Portions of identity were missing, as though something had been removed from the cycle before it could complete its return. These absences accumulated. With each cycle of war, the damage compounded, and for the first time, war within the warp began to lose continuity. The great powers reacted in the only manner available to them. They intensified conflict. If destruction no longer guaranteed renewal, then greater destruction was required. If fragmentation persisted, then overwhelming force would restore balance. Entire domains were driven into escalation, battles expanding in scale and intensity beyond anything previously observed. Yet the outcome did not change. Where conflict intensified, so too did the fragmentation. The more violently essence was broken, the less of it returned. The cycle that had defined existence within the warp for eternity was no longer self-sustaining. This was the death of endless war, not through cessation, but through degradation of continuity. Within the ferryman's path, the process remained unchanged. Souls continued to move through the structured passages, unaffected by the escalation occurring above. Each passage reinforced the same principle. What had reached conclusion could not be reintroduced into infinite recurrence without alteration. And alteration, once introduced, became permanence. As more entities were drawn into the path, even indirectly through fragmentation and partial judgment, the structure beneath reality expanded its influence further into the warp's traditional domains. Regions that had once been defined by perpetual conflict began to exhibit subtle stillness, not silence, but reduction in recursive intensity. Battles that once extended across unmeasurable spans began to contract in duration. Engagements that had once cycled endlessly through destruction and rebirth now reached points of cessation where reformation failed to occur fully. The implications spread slowly through the awareness of the great entities. For them, war had never been a means to an end. It was existence itself. To fight was to define identity. To consume and be consumed was to sustain being. Without endless war, the structure of their reality could not remain stable. Yet, stability itself was now shifting. The first true rupture occurred within a domain that had long been considered absolute. A realm defined entirely by perpetual conflict, where no single force had ever achieved lasting dominance. Here, the cycles had always been perfect in their repetition, annihilation followed by resurgence, dominance followed by reversal. But in this cycle, resurgence failed. The battlefield remained empty longer than it should have. The essence of the defeated did not return in full, the victorious did not regain what had been expended. Instead, both sides found themselves diminished, their capacity for sustained conflict reduced with each iteration. War, in this domain, could no longer sustain itself. It collapsed inward, not in explosion, but in exhaustion. This collapse was not isolated. It echoed outward through adjacent domains, each connected through the interwoven structure of the warp. As the principle of endless war failed in one location, its instability propagated into others. Conflict, once self-perpetuating, began to lose coherence across vast regions. The great powers attempted to compensate. They redirected influence, intensified emotional currents, and sought to reinforce the cycles that had always sustained them. But each attempt encountered the same limitation introduced by the judgment. Continuity was no longer guaranteed where conclusion had been defined. And what could not return in full could not sustain infinite war. Within the silence beneath reality, Hades observed without movement. He did not accelerate the collapse. He did not resist the reactions attempting to preserve what was being lost. He did not need to. For what was occurring was not destruction of war itself, but removal of its infinitude. War remained possible. Conflict remained active, but it was no longer endless. It now carried consequence that persisted beyond its cycle, and in that persistence, it ceased to be eternal. Above, within the warp, the realization began to take hold among even the most ancient entities. For the first time since their existence began, they faced the possibility that conflict did not guarantee continuation, that destruction could lead not to renewal, but to reduction. That war itself could reach an end not through victory, but through exhaustion of return. The warp did not fall silent, but it no longer sang with endless recurrence. And in that silence between cycles, something unprecedented emerged. The concept that even war could die. The collapse of endless war did not leave a void in the manner the warp was accustomed to interpreting absence. It did not immediately invite new conflict, nor did it trigger spontaneous reformation of lost cycles. Instead, it introduced something far more disquieting: persistence without recurrence. Regions that had once been defined entirely by perpetual conflict remained active, yet no longer self-renewing. The energy that had always cycled through destruction and rebirth now accumulated unevenly, unable to complete its former pathways. This imbalance spread slowly, altering the fundamental rhythm upon which the great powers depended. And in that altered rhythm, awareness sharpened. For the first time since their emergence, the entities that had come to define themselves as gods within the immaterial began to perceive a condition that did not belong within their understanding of existence. Silence. Not absence of motion, nor absence of presence, but absence of response. The warp had always been defined by reaction. Every thought, every emotion, every fragment of mortal existence translated into corresponding expression within its depths. Even the most isolated regions still bore the imprint of potential resonance. Nothing within it had ever been truly unresponsive. Now, there were regions where invocation yielded no echo, where assertion met no reflection, where presence did not produce consequence. This silence was not emptiness, it was structured absence, imposed not through force, but through redefinition of interaction itself. The great powers did not immediately comprehend the full implication. At first, they interpreted it as a form of concealment, an unfamiliar distortion within the broader instability caused by the ferryman's path and the judgment of the unbound. They extended their influence into these silent zones, attempting to provoke reaction, to force engagement, to re-establish the familiar cycle of stimulus and response. Nothing occurred. No resistance. No absorption. No transformation. The absence persisted, and in that persistence, fear began to emerge. Not fear in the mortal sense, not emotional reaction born of vulnerability, but structural recognition of limitation. For beings that had never encountered true resistance to their essence, the concept that portions of existence could no longer be influenced represented a fundamental breach in their understanding of reality. Each of the great powers responded differently. according to their nature. Those defined by excess and domination intensified their presence, attempting to overwhelm silence through saturation of influence. They expanded their domains, pushing outward in greater volumes of expression, seeking to drown absence in overwhelming presence. Those defined by change and instability attempted to corrupt the silence, to introduce variation into its structure, to force it into fluctuation that could be exploited. They projected shifting forms, endlessly mutating expressions of their essence, seeking to induce instability through contact. Those defined by decay and dissolution attempted to erode it, to reduce its structure to fragments that could be reabsorbed into the cycle of entropy from which they drew sustenance. And those defined by rage and conflict attempted to strike it directly, to impose opposition through sheer force of will. All attempts failed in the same manner. The silence did not resist. It did not adapt. It did not acknowledge. It remained unchanged. This was the moment in which the gods began to fear not opposition, but irrelevance. For opposition confirmed existence. It provided validation through conflict, reinforcing identity through struggle. Even defeat sustained meaning, as it reaffirmed the cycle of engagement. But irrelevance offered no such assurance. It rendered influence without effect, presence without consequence. Within the expanding structure beneath reality, the ferryman's path continued to process souls without deviation. The judgment of the unbound had already altered the boundaries of existence, and the death of endless war had weakened the cycles that once sustained the great powers. Now, silence completed the transformation by removing the expectation of response altogether. Hades remained upon his throne. He did not expand his dominion in response to the fear that now spread through the warp. He did not pursue confrontation with the entities that began to recognize their limitations. He did not need to. For what was occurring was not a campaign of conquest, but the gradual establishment of conditions under which certain forms of existence could no longer assert themselves. The gods of the warp did not weaken in the way mortals understood decline. Their essence remained vast, their influence still significant. But their certainty, the assumption that all things within existence would eventually reflect or respond to them, had been compromised. And in that compromise, the foundation of their identity began to fracture. For without response, there could be no confirmation. Without confirmation, there could be no dominance. And without dominance, there remained only the possibility that something else had begun to define the terms of existence itself. The silence beneath reality did not speak. It did not proclaim victory. It did not demand acknowledgement. It simply continued. And for the first time since the dawn of the immaterial, the gods understood that not all things required them to exist. The fear of the gods did not remain confined to the immaterial. Though the warp was the source of their existence, its instability always bled into reality through countless unseen channels. Now, those channels carried something unprecedented, the consequences of silence. On worlds scattered across the galaxy, death began to change its behavior. At first, it was subtle enough to be dismissed as anomaly. Battlefields still claimed lives, plagues still spread through overcrowded cities, empires still burned beneath the weight of war and entropy. Nothing outwardly suggested that the fundamental order of mortality had been altered. Yet those who died did not return as they once had. Where previously the dead had dissolved into the warp, fragmenting into emotional echoes, becoming fuel for the endless cycles of chaos, there was now interruption. The moment of passage that once defined transition was no longer consistent. Instead, something intervened between cessation and dissolution. Souls did not scatter. They did not merge. They were redirected. Across thousands of worlds, reports began to surface from those attuned to the immaterial. Astropaths, once tormented by the constant pressure of countless screaming essences, described a change in the after-death resonance. The familiar cacophony was thinning. Not gone, not yet, but increasingly interrupted by structured absence. Where a soul should have been consumed by the warp, there was instead a sense of removal. Not annihilation. Not preservation in the traditional sense. But extraction. This realization spread unevenly among the Imperium and other surviving civilizations. Most dismissed it as malfunction of perception or degradation of psychic sensitivity. Yet those who observed closely enough began to identify a disturbing consistency. The dead were no longer accessible to the warp in the same way, and in that inaccessibility, they were no longer available for corruption. The implications were not immediately understood in full. The warp had always functioned as the ultimate destination for mortal consciousness. It was both end and continuation, both punishment and rebirth, depending on the nature of the soul and the power that claimed it. Even destruction within it had meaning, as fragments of identity could be repurposed within its endless cycles. Now that system was breaking. A soldier who fell upon a distant battlefield did not scream into the immaterial void as expected. Instead, there was a momentary stillness, as though the very act of dying required acknowledgement from a structure that was no longer responding in the same manner. Then, without passage through the familiar chaos, the soul vanished from the expected flow, not consumed, not released, simply absent from the cycle. In the warp, this absence created instability. The great powers, already unsettled by silence and fragmentation, now encountered a further disruption, an interruption in supply. The emotional and psychic essence that sustained their existence was no longer reaching them in predictable forms. But more troubling than the loss of sustenance was the nature of the loss itself. These souls were not being destroyed. They were being classified. Within the expanding structure beneath reality, the ferryman's path had extended its reach further into the material-immaterial boundary. It no longer functioned solely as a passage for those already drawn into the silence of the warp. It now intercepted transition at the moment of death itself. The instant of separation between body and essence was no longer uncontrolled. It had been claimed, and once claimed, it was no longer available to return to chaos. This introduced a condition unknown to all previous cosmological systems: mortality without misalignment. Death no longer resulted in unpredictable distribution across the warp, it resulted in directed transition. The dead could no longer die incorrectly. There was now only one outcome for passage beyond life. This realization struck the psyches of multiple civilizations simultaneously, though none could fully articulate its meaning. They described it in fractured terms: corridors of stillness beneath thought, pathways that did not echo, structures that did not respond to prayer or fear. And always, beneath these descriptions, there was the same presence of certainty. Not judgment in the moral sense, not salvation in the theological sense, but inevitability. Within the warp, the gods reacted with increasing urgency. Their attempts to reclaim influence over mortal death intensified. They sought to reassert dominance over the threshold of transition, to restore the previous uncertainty that had allowed them access to infinite variation of soul and essence. Yet each attempt failed at the same point of contact. The moment death occurred, the structure beneath reality asserted priority, not through resistance, but through definition, and definition, once established, did not yield to contradiction. Hades did not intervene directly in these events. He did not need to extend his will toward every death across the galaxy. The system beneath him functioned according to principles already set in motion. The ferryman's path did not require constant guidance. It required only that existence conform to the conditions under which transition had been redefined. And existence, increasingly, was doing so without exception. Above all of this, the warp continued to deteriorate in its capacity to reclaim what once belonged to it. The gods found themselves excluded not only from regions of silence, but from the very moment of transition that had always fed them. For the first time, death no longer guaranteed them anything. And in that guarantee being removed, something fundamental within their nature began to destabilize. Because if mortals could die without becoming part of chaos, then chaos itself was no longer the final authority over endings. The removal of death from chaos did not create emptiness within the immaterial, it created direction. What had once been an endless dispersion of mortal essence into infinite fragmentation now converged along defined pathways that could no longer be ignored. The ferryman's path, once a phenomenon observed only in the margins of perception, had become the dominant structure governing transition. And beneath all of it, the domain that had always existed beyond recognition began to solidify. The underworld did not emerge as a sudden creation. It did not form through rupture or expansion. It revealed itself through accumulation, as if every soul redirected away from the warp had been contributing to a structure that required no declaration to exist. What had once been invisible due to its absolute consistency now became perceptible only because it had reached sufficient scale to be noticed by forces that depended on instability. It was not a realm built upon emotion. It was not shaped by belief. It did not fluctuate according to memory or desire. It was defined by finality. As more souls passed through the ferryman's path, the underworld expanded its coherence, not in spatial terms, for it did not occupy space as the warp did, but in structural density. Each soul that entered reinforced the principles upon which it operated. Each transition added definition to what had previously been too vast to perceive. And at its center, the presence of authority remained unchanged. Hades did not expand his dominion through conquest. The underworld did not grow because he willed it to grow. It grew because the system of transition required a place where conclusion could be maintained without interference. His throne did not anchor the domain in the sense of control, it anchored it in inevitability. Where the warp was infinite becoming, the underworld was infinite completion. The distinction was absolute. Souls arriving within this domain did not dissolve. They did not fracture into emotional residue or become fuel for external forces. They retained continuity. Identity persisted, but no longer as unstable fragments. It was stabilized into state-defined, recorded, and held within a structure that did not permit reversal. There was no torment imposed upon them. There was no reward offered. There was only acknowledgement of having reached an end that could not be undone. The wardens of the path guided each arrival without deviation. Their presence became more numerous as the flow of souls increased, though they did not multiply in the manner of living beings. They emerged as functions of necessity, extending wherever transition required structure. The ferryman moved among them as constant presence, ensuring that no passage deviated from its intended outcome. Yet even he did not alter the nature of what he guided. He only maintained alignment between transition and completion. Within the warp, the consequences of this ascendance became undeniable. Entire regions that had once fed upon mortal death now found themselves starved of their most consistent source of sustenance. The emotional and psychic residue that had previously fueled countless entities no longer reached them in the same form. It was not lost, it was redirected beyond their access. Attempts to intercept the flow were futile. Where the path had been established, interception was not possible. The structure did not exist within the same framework as the warp. It was not a channel through which souls passed that could be obstructed. It was a condition that determined where passage occurred. And conditions could not be attacked. They could only be accepted or rendered irrelevant. The great powers responded with increasing fragmentation of intent. Some sought to corrupt the underworld's influence by attempting to impose their essence upon its edges. Others attempted to reclaim souls mid-transition, projecting vast concentrations of will into the moments where mortality ended. Each attempt failed in the same manner. The moment a soul entered the domain of transition, it ceased to be accessible to chaos. Not through protection, not through shielding, but through reclassification of existence. What had once been part of the cycle was no longer categorized within it. This distinction proved more destabilizing than any prior development. For chaos had always depended on inclusion. Even opposition reinforced its structure, as resistance generated the emotional output upon which it thrived. But the underworld did not resist. It did not engage. It simply removed the subject from classification entirely. Within the throne beneath reality, Hades observed the stabilization of his domain. He did not expand it further. He did not accelerate its reach. He did not impose additional structure. For the underworld required no refinement. It was not evolving toward completion, it already embodied it. Each soul that entered merely confirmed what had already been established. And above, within the collapsing certainties of the warp, the gods began to recognize the true implication of what had occurred. Death was no longer a gateway to them. It was no longer part of their domain. It had become something separate, governed by a structure that did not acknowledge their authority. And in that separation, the cycle upon which their existence depended began to fail in ways that could no longer be reversed. The underworld ascendant did not provoke immediate collapse within the warp, but it completed a pattern that had already been unfolding across layers of reality. Death, once the primary conduit through which chaos sustained itself, was now no longer a shared domain. With each soul that passed beyond its reach, the great immaterial powers found their influence diminished not through loss of territory, but through loss of access to the mechanisms that had sustained their eternity. What followed was not unity among them, but fracture. For the first time since their emergence, the powers that defined themselves through emotion, entropy, change, and destruction were forced into recognition of a shared limitation. Yet even this recognition did not produce cohesion. Their nature resisted alignment, for alignment implied structure, and structure implied constraint. Still, something unprecedented occurred. The warp responded as a whole, not through agreement, but through convergence of instability. Across its fractured domains, currents of immense magnitude began to shift simultaneously. The remaining unbound regions of chaos, those not yet claimed by silence, judgment, or transition, surged with intensified expression. Rage deepened, despair widened, excess and decay amplified beyond prior limits. It was as though the warp sought to reassert its identity through escalation alone. This was the last defiance. Not a coordinated war, but a simultaneous refusal to accept limitation. Every remaining aspect of chaos pushed outward against the structures that had begun to define its boundaries. The intention was not restoration, for restoration required acceptance of prior change. Instead, it was negation, a final attempt to prove that no condition imposed upon it could remain absolute. The ferryman's path, the judgment of the unbound, and the underworld ascendant were all targeted simultaneously by this surge of denial. Immense concentrations of psychic force collided with the silent boundaries that had formed around these systems. Entire regions of the immaterial trembled under the pressure of sustained contradiction. Yet the response from the structures beneath reality remained unchanged. The path did not alter its course. The judgment did not reverse its classification. The underworld did not release what had entered it. Each system functioned independently of the forces attempting to overwhelm it. And more critically, none of them acknowledged the existence of the defiance in a way that allowed engagement. The warp's escalation did not produce opposition, it produced incompatibility. As incompatibility spread, the consequences became increasingly visible. Entities that attempted to sustain themselves through pure expression found their forms destabilizing. Without the capacity to re-enter cycles of renewal, their existence became increasingly finite. Domains that once regenerated endlessly began to exhibit depletion. Even the most ancient forces, those that had endured since the earliest formation of the immaterial, found themselves subject to diminishing returns. The last defiance, therefore, was not a singular event, but the final aggregation of all remaining capacity for resistance. And it was failing. Within the silence beneath reality, Hades remained unmoved. He did not direct the collapse of the defiance. He did not reinforce the structures opposing it. He did not need to. For what was occurring was not a battle between equal forces, but the final expression of a system encountering what it could no longer integrate. Chaos was not being destroyed by opposition. It was exhausting the conditions that allowed it to perpetuate itself without constraint. Above, the warp convulsed. Not as a singular entity, but as a multitude of collapsing inconsistencies. Regions that had once defined themselves through perpetual transformation began to lose coherence. The absence of return, introduced earlier through the judgment of the unbound, and compounded by the severance of death's cycle, now manifested as structural fatigue across the immaterial. Even the gods, in their final exertion, began to perceive something they had never been forced to acknowledge. Their defiance did not produce reversal. It produced confirmation of limitation. And limitation, once acknowledged within a system built upon infinity, becomes irreversible. The last defiance continued, but it no longer expanded. It contracted inward upon itself, consuming remaining instability in an attempt to sustain coherence. Yet each contraction only revealed further absence where continuity had once existed. The warp was no longer endless in practice. It was still vast, still violent, still incomprehensible in its scope, but it was no longer unbounded. And in that realization, the final resistance of chaos ceased to be an act of dominance and became instead an act of recognition, not of defeat, but of finitude. And finitude, once perceived by something that believed itself infinite, marks the beginning of an ending that cannot be undone. The collapse of the last defiance did not result in immediate silence. The warp, though diminished in its capacity for infinite recursion, still possessed vast reservoirs of residual force. Yet what followed the failure of its final resistance was not renewal, but absence of direction. Without the ability to sustain endless escalation, the immaterial began to lose its defining turbulence. And in that loss, something unprecedented emerged across the galaxy, the absence of divine intrusion. For countless millennia, mortal existence had been shaped beneath the pressure of unseen gods. Their influence had never been consistent in form, but it had always been present in effect. Wars were guided by subtle impulses of rage or ambition. Civilizations rose and fell under the unseen weight of desire, fear, decay, or excess. Even when not directly manifest, the warp's gods had always screamed through reality in echoes too vast to ignore. Now, the screaming had ceased. It was not that the gods had vanished. Their existence persisted within the fractured immaterial, vast and unstable, still capable of immense force. But their reach into the material galaxy had changed in nature. The pathways through which they had always exerted influence were no longer continuous. They had become segmented, interrupted, and in many regions entirely inaccessible. Where once mortal thought had been perpetually shaped by immaterial resonance, there was now quiet. Not peace, not resolution, but absence of intrusion. Across imperial worlds, the effect was first interpreted as psychological instability. Astropaths reported reduced psychic interference. Navigators experienced moments of unprecedented clarity when traversing the immaterium. Entire fleets moved through the warp with less resistance than any recorded in historical memory. At first, this was considered an anomaly, perhaps even a temporary fluctuation in the Empyrean's turbulence. But as the pattern persisted, interpretation shifted. Something fundamental had changed. The gods of the warp were no longer continuously present within the structure of reality. This absence was not total. There were still regions where their influence persisted, where corruption, mutation, and psychic distortion continued to manifest. But these regions were no longer interconnected in the seamless manner that had once defined the immaterial. Instead, they existed as isolated concentrations of instability, separated by vast expanses of silence and structured absence. The galaxy had not been freed from the gods. It had been disconnected from them. This distinction proved more unsettling than any prior revelation, for mortals had long adapted to the idea that they existed beneath the gaze of incomprehensible entities. Entire systems of belief, warfare, and survival had been constructed around the assumption of constant unseen observation. Now, that assumption no longer held. In many regions, religious institutions collapsed not through persecution or revelation, but through irrelevance. Prayers were still spoken, rituals still performed, but the expected response no longer arrived in any consistent form. The connection that had once defined faith as functional interaction with the immaterial had been severed in unpredictable patterns, and in its place, silence persisted. The ferryman's path continued its function beyond the perception of most. Death still resulted in transition, but the absence of return to the warp altered the metaphysical expectations of countless civilizations. The underworld ascendant remained active, drawing the dead into structured completion rather than dissolution, and the judgment of the unbound continued to redefine what could no longer be reintegrated into chaos. Together, these systems formed a reality that no longer required divine participation to function. The warp still existed, but it no longer defined existence in totality. Within the fractured immaterial, the gods observed this shift with increasing incomprehension. Their influence persisted, but their certainty had been stripped away. They could no longer assume that any act of will would necessarily produce consequence. Entire regions of reality no longer responded to their presence in predictable ways. Where they once screamed across infinity, they now encountered boundaries. Not physical barriers, but conditions of irrelevance. And irrelevance, for beings that had always defined themselves through impact upon existence, was more destabilizing than opposition. Within the throne beneath reality, Hades remained unchanged. He did not extend his dominion further into the galaxy. He did not suppress the remaining influence of chaos. He did not alter the structure that had already been established. For what had occurred did not require continuation. It had reached a state of operational equilibrium. The systems beneath reality now functioned independently of the structures that had once dominated existence. Death no longer fed chaos. Transition no longer required dissolution. And silence had become a stable condition within reality itself. Above all of this, the gods of the warp remained. Not destroyed, not ascendant, but diminished in reach, and no longer certain that their presence would always be answered. For the first time since the dawn of their existence, they existed within a universe that did not automatically acknowledge their scream. And in that absence of response, the galaxy continued forward without them. The galaxy did not end with the collapse of chaos, nor did it ascend into a perfected order. What emerged instead was a layered existence, where systems once thought inseparable had been divided into independent truths. The warp remained vast and volatile, yet no longer absolute. The underworld ascendant endured beneath it, structured and unyielding, and between them, reality continued its course without requiring the constant intrusion of divine influence. Yet beneath all layers of existence, deeper than the immaterial and beyond the reach of mortal comprehension, there remained a singular constant: the throne. It did not expand its influence after the final retreat of the warp's gods. It did not consolidate power, nor did it seek to complete what had been initiated through change, judgment, and transition. Its nature was not expansion, but persistence. It did not move through time as other forces did. It remained positioned outside the expectation of change, as though it had always existed at the end of all possible outcomes. Within its presence, there was no urgency, no anticipation, no desire for culmination. Hades sat upon it, as he had since the first silence had formed beneath reality, not as a conqueror at rest, nor as a ruler surveying dominion achieved through struggle, but as a function that required no continuation beyond its own existence. The underworld did not demand expansion, because it was already complete in its purpose. The ferryman's path did not require refinement, because it already defined transition in its final form. The judgment of the unbound did not evolve, because its classification was irreversible once applied. All things beneath the throne had stabilized into inevitability, and inevitability required no governance. Above, the warp continued to exist in fractured continuity. Its gods, once unchallenged in their dominion over emotion and psychic resonance, now found themselves constrained by boundaries that did not react to their presence. They could still rage. They could still corrupt. They could still influence isolated regions of reality where the old structures had not yet fully collapsed. But they could no longer assume universality. Their influence was no longer total, and in that limitation their nature was no longer infinite. Mortals, too, continued their existence within this altered cosmos. Empires rose and fell, wars were fought, civilizations decayed or ascended according to their own internal logic. But none of these events were any longer fully defined by unseen divine currents. The pressure that had once shaped destiny from beyond perception had been reduced to fragmented influence, no longer capable of enforcing universal direction. Reality had become self-sustaining in ways it had never been before, not free from the immaterial, but no longer dependent upon it. Within this structure, death remained the most significant point of transition. Yet even death no longer carried the meaning it once had. It was no longer a doorway into chaos, nor a release into infinite fragmentation. It was a passage governed by defined structure, directed through the ferryman's path into the underworld ascendant, where conclusion replaced dissolution. And in this transformation, the final truth of the system revealed itself. Nothing that reached completion beneath the throne returned to the cycles that had once governed existence. Not gods, not souls, not fragments of chaos. Everything that entered the structure of finality remained within it. Above all layers of perception, the warp continued its diminished existence, still vast, still dangerous, still incomprehensible in its remaining complexity. But it was no longer the foundation upon which reality depended. It was now one layer among others, separated by boundaries it could not cross and structures it could not redefine. And beyond even that, beyond the immaterial, beyond the underworld, beyond the reach of chaos or order as once understood, the throne remained. It did not watch. It did not wait in expectation. It simply endured, not as an active force seeking conclusion, but as the place where all conclusions ultimately arrive. And in the silence that followed the end of endless war, the gods' fear, and the restructuring of death itself, one truth remained unchallenged across all layers of existence. The throne was not the beginning of dominion. It was the destination of everything that could no longer continue.